Chapter 9, Part 6. So we are looking at the Toltec warrior columns here, the Tula warrior columns. Quite large, monumental scale. Remember, human scale is 6 feet, so anything above that is monumental. So this is like, 2 and 3 times human height. So it's meant to intimidate. They're very rigid looking and they have a lot of symbols and so on, but these are figures to support the religion and also to increase power and prestige. They're giving a sense of a formidable army, right, that could crush anything. And you see this in many cultures. Like the Eastern Island heads, there's also some heads in Mexico and South America, very similar. Okay, we're off to Africa again, Nigeria. There's a lot of things because of trade with Europe and the Americas that we started to interact with Nigeria and some other countries, Sierra Leone, the West Coast African countries, the Ivory Coast. So we do have a fair amount of their artwork that has survived. These plaques were covering an entire interior, the columns on the interior of a palace, and unfortunately that was burned to the ground. And then I believe the English took a lot of these plaques back to England, where they still are. And I think it was a fairly nefarious situation, but at any rate, these survive, and their intent were to intimidate again and impress. So you would go into a palace and there would be brass, and from what I understand, these were all shiny. They weren't darkened like they are here. This is our interpretation of how brass or bronze might look, but these were very shiny, and so it was very reflective and shiny. And you're going in this hall with all this shiny stuff, looking at you with these intimidating warriors, and you're going to feel overwhelmed, right? Our guy here in the center, now I'm going to talk about hierarchical scale a little bit here. He's in the center. Now that isn't part of hierarchical scale exactly, but central figure, we know he's most important. That's a common formal quality. But the fact that he is larger, even though these are physically probably the same physique, he could even actually be in reality smaller than these people on his sides. But the king, and in this case we have a warrior king, as opposed to, if you remember Justinian, he was a priest king. So we have a warrior king. He's going to be depicted larger than the people around him because he is more important. That is part of hierarchical scale. Okay, we're going to get into one other demonstration of that in a moment with some Egyptian work. So he dominates this composition. He's frontal, he's symmetrical, and this piece is also symmetrical if we slice it down this way. All right, the Great Wall, which kind of was a big failure, pardon the pun, because I know we're contemplating another wall, which will probably equally be as big a failure. But at any rate, this Great Wall was built in 206 BC, and then it started at that point and it continued on for another 1500, 1800 years. Long time. It's 1500 miles long, but it's actually not that hard to climb and get over in certain places. So it was somewhat of a fail, but one sort of anecdotal thing I'll tell you is that you can see this from space. So when people are orbiting in the space shuttle, they can see the Great Wall. It's massive, it's huge, it's long. It's 1,500 miles long. So it's probably like the biggest thing ever made by humans in a lot of ways, if you think about that. So it was strategically placed, and there were watchtowers. Siege watchtower would be here, there'd be another one over here, and so on. So that people could, the warriors rather, or the military could protect the direction to, keep people out. And then has some cannon, sort of embrasures, some areas where you attach the cannon so it won't pull back too far, and signal stations. So smoke by day, fires by night. And this is a wonder of the world. Okay, war scenes. We're going to go on, and remember I talked about hierarchical scale in that first case in Africa. Well, technically we're in Africa, but we're in Egypt here. This is the Palette of Narmer, and he is a king, and he's unifying northern and southern Egypt, also lower and upper. Upper is another way to think about it. Up and down the Nile, basically. He is subjugating a person here. He's killing this person, and then there's some dead slaves down here. Again, he's larger. That's hierarchical scale. These guys are smaller. And then there's a line here. This is called a register. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but a register is sort of like our cell of animation or our graphic novel box, if you think about it that way. So that's where the main story is going on. It's central, and the stuff below it is less important. So his feet are on top of these dying or dead slaves. So that's showing that he is more important than these slaves. So that's the way that this piece works. This one has one register here. Actually, this line here above that is above the register, but that's a little bit more ornamental. Story going on here, story going on here, story going on here. This one just has two. Okay, so memorable, glorious, action-filled art is documenting battles. It's emphasizing the horrors of war. Many cultures had no problem depicting some pretty brutal stuff, and we're going to be getting into that with our own culture as well moving forward. Okay, a lot of detail here. I'm going to let you go over all this stuff in the straight PowerPoint, but a nice visual here. Comparing here the battle scenes, which is interesting. If you were to go back to your elements and principles, look how active this is with the fire. It's a lot of motion and activity. This is very static by comparison. And look how realistic those flames look. I mean, they're still stylized, but it's much more dynamic and interesting. Okay. All right. So, burning of the Sanjo Palace. Excuse me. It's a scene from the Heiji Monogatari, and this is a scroll. So the way that Japanese and in some case Chinese works of art are interpreted, they're kind of like a curled up piece of paper, right? This one's 23 feet long. And it would be rolled out, and you'd look at a certain amount of the story at one time. So it would be kind of linear, like the beginning story would be at one edge, and then you would curl it up as you go along. But this is the tale of two feuding clans in the 12th century. Gorgeous piece. And it's got some strong visual contrast. It's really trying to bring your focus into the action here, and also the destruction here. All right, so gory details. Matthew Brady, very famous photographer, one of the first, probably the first famous photographer. He photographed the Civil War, 1865. This is around the time the camera is invented in the 1800s. A little bit before that, the Civil War was the first war that was documented with photography. And I know everybody's got a cell phone and they've got access to images and taking photos all the time, but you have to remember that this was a very new technology in the 1800s. It was done for portraits of family, and it was taken out into the world and documenting horrific tragedies. And there's some other dark history to photography, but I won't go there. But they're not sure with Matthew Brady, in particular, with this photo and a couple others, if he didn't stage it, because some people thought the body would be more twisted than this in reality. So you may not be looking at an actual dead person. You might be looking at somebody who is staged to show the horrors of war. So he may have exaggerated this or, completely made it up. So he's the first one that to photograph war. Well, I didn't know it was that many. Sorry, I didn't preview this. 3,500 photographs. Good heavens, that's a lot of photographs. But he often arranged things. Okay. So this is a beautiful piece. I just absolutely love Battle of Little Bighorn. Now the Sioux and some other Plains Indians began this tradition. Now this isn't exactly correct, this type of paper, but ledger drawings, because they were trying to communicate with. They were gathered up in the forts. Does that make sense? All those forts that you've heard about that the cavalry set up. And a lot of Native Americans were rounded up, not in a good way, but at any rate, they're at this fort and they want to depict stuff the way they would in a weaving, or they would on pottery, or they would in other artwork, sand art, and so on. So there's nothing like that available to them in this space. So they give them whatever papers on hand. So they start to draw out a lot of imagery, and I don't know how the color pencils or the color came about. I don't exactly know the history of that, but they wanted to depict some battle scenes and draw it out, and so that's kind of how this happened with this style that's sort of a combination of native style with Western or European style, more to the point of Western style. And that's kind of why it looks a bit crude, because they're learning this style at this point. Okay, so this is a version of Custer's Last Stand. The Sioux warriors advanced from the right. Custer was defeated, and the dead and wounded from both sides are the bottom. Okay. Another kind of horrific imagery. Now, this is a movie that was made about the Russian Revolution. Remember, I said that the first war that was documented was World War II. World War I was not documented with film to a great degree. This was done in 1925, so it was a film that he put together. Potemkin, very famous battleship Potemkin, Sergei Eisenstein. He made a film about the horrors of the Russian Revolution in 1917, which was during World War I.